Thank you. Welcome to this meeting of the Wingecarribee Local Planning Panel on the 26th of July 2023. I declare the meeting open at 2 p.m. My name is Julie Walsh and I'm the chair of today's panel. Also sitting on the panel today are expert members Linda Kelly and Scott Barwick and community member Dennis McManus. Acknowledgement of country. Wingecarribee Shire Council acknowledges the Gundungurra and Tharawal people as the traditional custodians of this land we now call the Wingecarribee Shire. I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders present here today. There are no apologies and there are no declarations of interest. The procedure for the meeting. The Council website contains a copy of the operational guidelines for the panel meetings, but I'll summarise the most important points. All panel members have read the business paper and received a briefing from Council staff. The panel is charged with determining the one development application and providing advice on the 4 strategic planning items on the agenda today. We'll hear from registered speakers, members of the public first, followed by applicants' representatives. Each speaker is limited to 3 minutes, but that may be extended at my discretion. The panel members may have questions and I may seek a response to any issue raised from the relevant council officer. Once a speaker has spoken, they will not be permitted to speak again unless it is in response to a question by the chair or other panel member. Once we've heard from all speakers, we'll move into closed session to deliberate and we'll return to the public meeting to announce our decisions. That will be live streamed. The minutes of the meeting should be placed on the council website within 2 business days. And could I please ask everyone to place their mobile phones on silent? So the first item is 5.1, planning proposal to amend Schedule 1 to enable a boundary adjustment to land at Elizabeth Street and Old Bong Bong Way, Burradoo. I have Scott Lee from LEP Planning registered to address the panel on behalf of the applicant.
If there are questions, I'm happy, otherwise
Oh, okay, just come forward. There might be questions. I think I had a question.
Go on.
So, Mr. Lee, in the report and in the planning proposal, it's stated that it's not intended to allow any further subdivision potential. So you'll have the large lot with the rural use and the smaller lot as a large dwelling lot. But the report goes through the provisions of the LEP that would enable a further subdivision take place, and there are 2 options suggested. One is to make Lot A a minimum lot size of 9,300 square metres, and the other is to work with the Parliamentary Council's office to ensure that that's implemented in the LEP. If we were thinking of taking the option of making Lot A 9,300 square metres, would that pose a problem?
I don't think it's an insurmountable problem. I mean, I think that figure is probably a bit larger. That provides a larger residential portion than the owner had in mind. But in talking with him from day one, he is aware that we can't have a situation where the larger rural lot has capacity for further subdivision. So I suppose that our preference then would be to not restrict, not enforce a too large a lot for the residential, but acknowledge that we can't further subdivide the rural property. I think you were there today and had a look. Mm-hmm. So there seems a logical boundary between the 2 lots. That's probably less than the figure you've just quoted, mm-hmm. Chair. So ideally it would be good not to be able to achieve this without having to adjust that obvious fence and boundary between the 2, but we've got no objection whatsoever to having a provision that doesn't allow further subdivision.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you for coming today. You are in the next one, but I'll hear from the objectors first, yes. So the next item is 5.2, planning proposal to create a boundary adjustment on land at Mittagong Airfield. The first registered speaker I have is Elizabeth Butterfield. Elizabeth Butterfield's not here.
She did send through a written objection, which was the same as her submission that you already had a copy of.
Right. So I might actually just defer this one just in case she's running late or something. So 5.3 is the planning proposal to include land at Yarrowa Road, Mossvale, within the Chelsea Gardens Kumungal Urban Release Area. There's no registered speakers for that one, so we'll deal with that in closed session. 5.4, the Robertson Village Place Plan. Again, there are no registered speakers. So that brings us to 6.1, DA 23/0607 for a dwelling, secondary dwelling, farm stay accommodation and shed at Lot 102 DP 775843 64 Clements Road, Woodlands. The first registered speaker I have is Malcolm McComas. If you could come forward. Please proceed.
District for over 100 years. My late mother-in-law acquired 220 and 232 Kells Creek Road in the 1970s and in the 1980s from the Clements family. We acquired 232 in 2012 and have done 3 DA approved improvements on the property over that time. There were nil objections to any of our DAs. That's because each of them met and respected the LEP zone objectives and the DCP controls for developments in this area, namely to protect and manage and restore the areas of significance, to provide a limited range of development that does not have an adverse effect on these values, and to encourage the retention of the remaining evidence of significant historic and social values expressed in the landscape, and of course to minimise the proliferation of buildings and other structures in these sensitive landscape areas. In particular, our developments have sought to minimise the proliferation of buildings and other structures in these sensitive areas by clustering them and not changing the impact for our neighbours. The proposed development has no regard to these objectives, in my opinion. In particular, there's no plan for a working farm. I doubt whether there ever will be. This land is degraded, flood-prone. It's a swamp for a substantial part of the year with rain and hasn't been used as a farm in any time over the last 40 years, to my knowledge. We agree with the contention that in the absence of an existing or proposed commercial farm, the proposed concept is flawed and can't be approved in its current form. The visual impact of the proposal on our property represents a significant disruption to the current setting. We can't see the current house site at 64 Clements Road in front of us to the north, day or night. The redevelopment of the current house site for a new proposed primary dwelling and shed would maintain the current setting. An adjoining secondary dwelling would also not impact the current setting. However, these considerations have been ignored in this DA application. Point 3, the siting of the new principal dwelling hard on our north boundary fence line is directly in front of our house to the north. Approving this DA today would materially damage our quiet enjoyment, our aspect, our bushland setting, and the peace and tranquility of the woodlands environment. The locals here love the dirt road, the absence of any other visible properties along the road, and the proximity to the Natai River Valley watercourses that feed Warragamba Dam about 30 k's to the north. This is a unique part of New South Wales wilderness with towering sandstone cliffs above the River Gorge country. The Bicentennial Walk, the Ensign Barulia track, starts at the bottom of Clements Road and runs 100 k's to Katoomba. This represents the current rural environment in which we live, and it should be respected and retained, in my opinion. The locality of the principal dwelling and substantial outbuildings on our common boundary does not protect the aesthetic values currently enjoyed by all residents along Woodlands and Clements Road. We agree with the comments that the social values for surrounding neighbours, evident in the existing land use pattern, fosters a mutual benefit for the rural and natural settings and good levels of separation to ensure adequate levels of visual and acoustic privacy. The proposal simply ignores these existing characteristics. The concept plan proposes 4 structures: a principal dwelling, a secondary dwelling, farm stay accommodation and sheds. This, in our opinion, is a gross overdevelopment spread across the entire property. In conclusion, we are not unreasonable people, but the proposed one-sentence proposal simply doesn't comply with the values Wingecarribee seeks to promote under its planning process. To approve this DA would simply smash the years of careful application of these rules, and in our view would set up the applicant for his next DA, a non-complying subdivision, into several blocks with continued clearing of bushland in a rural setting. Please consider supporting the Planning Officer's recommendation to refuse this DA. Thank you.
See if there's any questions. Thank you for coming along today.
Thanks.
So the next registered speaker is Hamish Blanche.
So in addition to our submission from January this year, I'd like to add some colour to our rejection. My wife and I both grew up in the countryside and hold the same values as Wingecarribee Council. We moved to the Southern Highlands to recapture our love for country and provide our children with a similar experience to our own. The feeling of space and privacy, fresh air and peace, nighttime stars and daytime views. We feel the proposed development invades and disturbs each of these elements. We feel the applicant has ignored the values of Wingecarribee Council and its residents with the proliferation of buildings, proximity to boundaries, impediment of views and invasion of privacy. With over 70 hectares of land, the applicant has chosen to build 2 of those buildings on greenfield sites on his neighbours' boundaries. I'm at a loss to know why. There was no consultation, and it appears no consideration of the consequences of his choices by the applicant. Our house deliberately captures the northerly view and has large windows in order to both highlight this and to be as energy efficient as possible. The applicant's proposal directly impedes our view and invades our privacy. He has direct views into our living and bedroom spaces, most notably at night. Our view north is uninterrupted to the Blue Mountains. No housing, no light or noise pollution. Why build a large machinery shed directly in front of us, impeding that view, polluting our night vision only 5 metres from the boundary? Why there rather than somewhere else on the 170 acres? Does this align with the values of Wingecarribee Council and its residents? I don't think so. Why allow other buildings to be scattered well away from the main dwelling? We have extended our original house on our land within the existing template, as have our neighbours at 232. The applicant has proposed to ignore the original template and build on brand new sites that will require roads and other infrastructure, as well as deliberately obstructing his neighbours. This is not the city, and we should protect our environment and enjoyment of country as long as we can. We submit to Council that it should refuse this application on the grounds outlined in our original submissions and consider the additional remarks set out by residents today. 2, require that any revised application locates the primary residence at the site of the current dwelling and locates any secondary dwelling or sheds to within 50 metres of the primary dwelling. Thank you.
Thank you. Did you have any questions? No. No. Thank you for coming along today. So the next registered speaker is Scott Lee. Did you want to go first or Mr. Scarcella? I wasn't sure.
Sorry. Yeah, Mr. Scarcella is here, but he's happy for me to
Sure, thank you.
take the
Please
take the floor at the moment, so that's what I'll do. Thank you. Just a few points in support, obviously, of the application. My client, Mr. Scarcella, is actually a reasonably new owner of the land. He's inherited a property that, as you've just heard, has not been well managed for some time. It's clearly in a state of neglect and disrepair. The objective of the owner is to bring the property back into some working order, in fact, to a working rural property, consistent with many rural properties across the Shire, including adjoining properties, that have established residential development of a contemporary standard, both principal and secondary dwellings, as well as potentially small-scale rural tourism in the form of farm stay accommodation. Nothing in the DA is out of the ordinary, and all of it is consistent with Council's strategic and statutory planning regimes. This vision is what was expressed in the site concept plan. The staged approach, to us at least, was a sensible idea, and the DA that we lodged with Council provided a chance for the whole of the site, or whole of site and whole of development analysis. The proposed site layout has taken into account the constraints of the site: bushfire, native vegetation, watercourses, site access. The chosen preferred locations on the site for the various elements therefore reflects that site analysis and places development envelopes where there are suitable locations. The identified envelopes are clear of native vegetation and provide safe locations from bushfire threat. They avoid watercourses and low-lying wet areas, and therefore they provide suitable effluent management areas, so there's no water quality concerns. Both the RFS and Water New South Wales responded with positive GTAs for the DA in the initial stages of the assessment. Excuse me. Those envelopes can be all accessed with internal driveways, and it will all enable ongoing or future agricultural use. All the proposed elements of the development are permissible. The principal and secondary dwellings, the farm stay, all can be approved in principle now. Because the DA is a staged application with a concept plan up front, subsequent DAs will be lodged and council will be able to assess the specific details of each stage to ensure that there are no breaches or variations to any standards. This is particularly pertinent in that question of the farm stay component, because we note that the land is farmland rated, which is a prerequisite for a commercial farm and farm stay accommodation, and extensive agriculture is permissible without consent. We do not agree with the report's conclusion that it's not possible to approve the farm stay as part of the concept approval. The development doesn't offend... Is that... No, keep going. Sorry. The development doesn't offend any of the objectives of the Rural Lands DCP. As we understand from the assessment report and the submissions and comments, there's a concern that some of the proposed building envelopes are not all clustered together, and are situated where future development may be visible to adjoining properties. Neither the objectives nor the controls of the Rural Lands Development Control Plan attempt to make development invisible. Buildings in the rural landscape are simply a feature of the Shire. You only have to drive anywhere around the Shire to know that. Excuse me. For any one of the adjoining properties, any view of the development on the site will be minimal, and only one of the potential building envelopes. The view of the future development would certainly not be unreasonable if those views were to be subjected to the view sharing principles that have been well established by the court and utilised regularly in development assessment. At best, the view impact from any one of the adjoining properties that may look across the site would be categorised as negligible, possibly minor, but not moderate, severe or devastating. In our view, or in our opinion rather, a negligible view loss is not a reason for the refusal. We believe there'll be no adverse impacts to any adjoining properties because what is proposed not only well considered and thoughtful outcome for the site, but provides a range of land uses that are common broadly across the Shire and across the local woodlands area. The final scale and design of development will be assessed in subsequent DAs. At this point in time, I'll just wrap up. Yes. At this point in time, there are no reasons why the principle of improving the property in the way that we have proposed should be rejected. And finally, should the panel decide that the DA in its totality couldn't be approved, we would ask for approval of part of the DA, and that would be the principal dwelling and farm building component with improved site access, and the applicant and owner would contemplate future farm stay or secondary dwelling applications at a later date. Happy to take some questions.
Okay, so we've got a copy of the master plan with the location of the
Sure.
buildings, and so we went out to this, we had a
Site,
look
yes.
from the adjoining properties to the south. So just starting with the proposed shed, which is very close to the southern boundary, what informed the location of that?
The availability of access, particularly, as explained by Mr. McComas, I mean, the property is lower down, is lower ground and is traversed by a number of watercourses.
Uh-huh.
So it is subject to more flow, and which means that access across the property and usable areas of the property are more restricted than they would be in other sites. So we're looking for the best locations that are workable, viable from the residential point of view as to where you would want to be on the property, and viable from an ongoing agricultural use. So we can't put infrastructure, buildings in locations that are not going to be suitable for that. So the site is constrained, but that's why we decided to look at a whole of site approach and identify where we thought that activities could be reasonably located and be successful. And then, if through that process, the applicant can commence a development and regeneration of the property with some confidence that all of those elements had been considered. So that was the logic.
Okay. And then, so my next question is, so the provision of the DCP that's referenced in the report that all rural buildings to be separated from each other by a distance of not more than
Yes.
30 metres, what do you say to us
What do I
about
say about
I mean,
that?
we've got to give
Yeah,
that,
that's fair enough. No,
it's due
that's-
consideration.
Yes,
What do
absolutely.
you say about that?
What I say about that is that that the 30 metres is a numerical imposition or control on an idea. And the idea in the development control plan is to avoid buildings that are inappropriate in a rural landscape. That means, so particularly a good example of that is the council talks about avoiding ridge lines, avoiding obvious views and vistas, or impacting directly on those views and vistas. Importantly, the DCP also talks a lot about from public spaces. And that, in the Shire, that generally means as people travel along the roads of the Shire and what impression they get of the Shire as they travel along. So avoiding obvious locations and plonking a building where nobody would have expected it to be. So to give some effect to that, the council, in most, well, not this council, but most councils or people writing planning controls then want to codify that in some way and put a figure on it. And the council has said, well, the best way we can do that is make sure everything's together. The reality is it doesn't work very well for a number of reasons. People who are wanting to live and work or live and have visitors don't want to be on top of each other, but they also don't need to be if you have other discrete locations where you can place buildings that are not visually intrusive in the landscape. The advantage here, and as I said in my submission, words here, none of that is about making things invisible, because that's not possible and it wouldn't be a fair and reasonable proposal. It's not the reality today anyway. You can travel anywhere across the site and you see buildings all over the place. So there's nothing wrong with having some building form in the rural landscape. It's avoiding adverse outcome. This site is discrete in the sense that it is not on a major through road, and you've really got to make a big effort to get down there to see it. So not many people are exposed to that. We have 3 identified building locations, and our view is that from any of the adjoining properties, one of those may be visible, but at some distance. From nowhere, I believe you would see all 3 and then get the sense that this site is somehow overdeveloped. Building or envelope 1, for want of a better word, the principal dwelling envelope and the shed are reasonably close to the southern boundary. That is true, but they're not reasonably close to the adjoining property or the buildings themselves, which are about 300 metres removed and more elevated. So our view was that in terms of an impact on view, like I said, that would be negligible. We haven't put it on the side boundary, 10 metres from the adjoining property. That would have been unreasonable. So we think the layout is fair and reasonable and is not inconsistent or offensive to those objectives of the DCP.
Thank you.
I guess I was trying to reconcile the quantum of development and the comment about extensive agriculture being permitted without consent of land, and that's generally grazing. I'm trying to be interested to understand what extensive agriculture would generate the need for a 2,750 square foot shed.
Oh, can I? Yeah, look, good question, but we're not contemplating that size shed. What we've identified, and this happens when we try to do this, probably, there's a confusion between the envelope and the actual development within the envelope. What we've identified on the concept at the moment is simply that location, and within that envelope there would be a farm building, for instance, or within the principal dwelling envelope, which I think is even larger again, you would have the principal dwelling. That's not going to be a dwelling of 5,000 square metres floor area. It will be somewhere within that location. It is possible to perhaps, modify those envelopes so they are smaller, but ultimately the final built form and the scale of that will be determined by the DAs that are lodged for that element of the DA. And that's the way that the concept approval process will work. So the council and everybody else gets an opportunity to gauge the suitability of that dwelling or that shed. It won't be that as big as the envelope, but it will be somewhere within that envelope.
I think the observation is probably the element of most obvious concern is that shed, both in its potential size and its proximity and its location in a view line.
Yeah.
I mean,
Okay.
I hear what you said about, your clients saying, well, if the farmstay is problematic in terms of things, you'd be open to a suggestion of not having that element.
That allows it to move forward, yeah.
But I think that location of the shed, and it's clearly contemplated that that's not necessarily the size of the shed that you would necessarily want associated with an ongoing extensive agricultural use of land. That need could almost be accommodated within the envelope of the primary dwelling.
Yeah, I understand, and I think of all those uses, I mean, the farm shed is a necessary piece of the puzzle, okay, but I would probably say that it has a bit of flexibility in where it could go and still be find it a useful spot or a suitable spot and end up being a useful element of the development. So we've identified it there. If that is a significantly problematic location, well then we can accommodate some movement of it.
Mr. Lee, just to be clear, you mentioned a fallback position for your client. Could you just state again what the fallback position is?
Yeah, I'm hoping that it doesn't come to this, but what I was saying was that if given the recommendation in front of the panel, which is to refuse the DA, we would much prefer an approval of part of the application rather than the refusal of all of it. And what I said was that if that was possible or contemplated by the panel as an outcome, it's our second option rather than, first option's approve the thing, but second option would be approve part of it, and that would be the envelope for the principal dwelling primarily, and I mentioned the shed, because that would enable the owner to get on and do what they really want to do and commence the process of bringing this property back into some working order. The other elements of farm stay and secondary dwelling are then ancillary to that principal dwelling in any event.
So just to clarify, the fallback position or second option is the business about the dwelling and the shed, the primary dwelling and the shed.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Would it be equally to observe, if the panel were to approve elements of this, none of it could be built anyway? It would all require the lodgement of the DA.
Correct.
So if the panel was to adopt the recommendation, it's still open for the owner to lodge the DA that he was going to have to anyway for a primary dwelling and a shed.
Yep. Correct.
And just move on with that.
That is true.
We're kind of not penalising anybody if that was the outcome.
I understand,
Yeah.
Mr. Barwick, yeah.
Penalising. Okay, understand. Thank you.
Correct, yes.
Okay, thank you for coming on today.
Thanks for the
So
opportunity. Thank you.
did Mr. Scarsella still want to? I think we've pretty much covered everything, haven't we? Yeah. Okay. Go back to 5.2, the planning proposal for a boundary adjustment on land at Mittagong Airfield. Did Elizabeth Butterfield? Oh, sorry? Oh, 5 minutes. Okay. So we normally go with the objectors first so that the applicant can, so we might just have, sorry? Why don't we do that? And if anything arises from her presentation that you feel a desperate need to respond to, you can have another say. Okay.
Appreciate that. Thanks very much. I mean, I don't have too much to say other, and I'm assuming again that you've been able to visit the airfield this morning.
Actually, there was one thing I did want you to address was the, you had a look at the submissions.
Yes.
So the submission from Ms. Butterfield, I think it was, about the dwelling entitlement and.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
I talked
wouldn't
briefly about that.
mind
I mean,
hearing about that. Thank you.
the genesis for this is that the club has 2 lots existing, but they don't match the land use. And one of the larger of those 2 lots has a dwelling entitlement confirmed by the council. There's no argument about that. But long-term management for the club really has been driving this, and the outcome should be to create a airfield or aero club lot and a, for want of a better word, a dwelling lot. We're not creating additional dwelling entitlements. We're not even, it actually wouldn't even lead to a different outcome of where that dwelling entitlement would be taken up. There's really only one location for it, and that exists now, and whether or not the boundaries are like this or like that, that's where a dwelling entitlement will be exercised. So it's really a land management exercise, and then through the through the LEP process, or plan proposal process, housekeeping. We did talk to council very early about the possibility of just a straight development application through a boundary adjustment, but the way that the clauses of the LEP operate, we ran the risk of undermining our existing dwelling entitlement. So in consultation with the council, the decision was made to lodge the planning proposal. So we're quite pleased that that part of the process has progressed to this stage, and with a recommendation that it proceed. The claim, I think the claim in one of the submissions was that the clubhouse was a dwelling house. It's not it's a clubhouse. It is not a dwelling house, never has been, and it's not capable of being one at the moment. It doesn't have the facilities that would make it capable of separate occupation, which is what a dwelling is defined as. So that, you may hear that if Ms. Butterfield speaks, but that is in fact not the case. The club has no intention of doing anything other than managing the aerofield, the clubhouse, okay, it's called a clubhouse, but it's not a house, and the hangars. All of those should be on one parcel of land. The dwelling entitlement that they already have the advantage of should be on one separate parcel of land. We have lodged that development application for the boundary adjustment, and again, we see that as purely and simply as a housekeeping matter that is a follow-on from the planning proposal. It's a procedural matter. The development of that residential lot and the take-up of the dwelling entitlement will be the subject of a future development application, and all of those issues that you would normally associate with a house in a rural property will have to be properly explored through that DA. The planning proposal is housekeeping to make land management for the club more logical.
Two of the panel members did the pre-gateway report, myself and Mr. Barwick. We've had a full briefing. We're aware of the role that the airfield plays in the locality.
Yes.
So I'm not sure, I've got Chris Byrne and Wayne Boatwright to address the panel. I'm happy to hear from them.
They're
if
not
they-
here today. I spoke with
Oh,
both of
okay,
them.
thank you.
But
All
they're,
right, so-
they're both.
Yeah, I was going to
that's
say,
the
I don't think
President
we need.
and Secretary
Yeah, I
of the
don't think
club.
we need to hear any.
No, I've spoken to
more.
them and they're
Yes,
happy.
Okay. Well, because we don't have a particularly full agenda and this is the last item, I think we will wait for Ms. Butterfield. I don't know whether we should have like a short adjournment or maybe just have a short adjournment, turn everything off and we'll turn it. Is that okay? We'll turn it back on when she comes?